within this institution that we call the church, there are often times in our lives when we have to make conscious decisions about making changes. Those sorts of things that happen with ourselves. And sometimes that happens with our buildings and our structures. We have to go beyond simple issues of maintenance and upkeep, and we have to look at redoing things for a particular reason. I was part of a congregation back in the 1980s. And this was as the movement was afoot, liturgical reform, where we were moving the altar away from the wall and standing behind it rather than standing in front of it and facing the wall. And this particular congregation had a very traditional church building. It was stone, it was beautiful, it was well over 100 years old, probably about 130 at this time. And it had the traditional nave with the sanctuary and the English choir structure in the front, facing each other, and the altar way back up in what would normally be the apse against the wall. But there was no room to pull it out, and they wanted to change how they did that, so they set about, how are we going to make changes in this building? Oh, by the way, we have next door the old rectory, which we've made into a parish house. We've expanded it, and we have a kitchen, and we need to update that space too. If you've been part of a church very much and very long, you know when you begin to make decisions like that, it gets a little dicey. You're not going to get through this without somebody getting upset. So it becomes an issue of keeping people informed and negotiating, and so they did that, and they did a really good job of that, and they came back and they opened up the front of this sanctuary and back to its original design, which was much more open. They didn't pull the altar out away from the wall. They set another altar down closer to the people, and that's where they would do the service. And all in all, it was well received. And next door, they went in and they redid the interior of the parish house, and they had new office space and a new kitchen and a new parish hall. It was really, really nice. And a few years later, it got hit by a tornado. Hit both buildings. As they began to do their assessments, they looked at the stone church and they realized that they could make that work again. They did structural reviews of it, and they were going to have to reinforce the walls, but that's okay. We can build this back and we can make it kind of like it was after we rebuilt it, but even better. And the nice part is when those things happen, not a lot of people object to what you're going to do because it's better than having nothing there. But here was this house next door, and it was hit too. And the walls were somewhat standing, and the roof was gone, and all the interior stuff was just destroyed. And as they did their structural analysis, something became clear. There was really no way they could maintain the integrity of that building and have structural integrity too. They let folks know all along what they were doing, and finally the vestry came to the point where they had to make this decision, and they made it. They said, we're going to take down this building. Now the building itself was also probably over 100 years old, and it was part of the historic fabric of this community as well as the church. So they let this information out, and then as they made this announcement, it seemed that all was well. They announced it on the weekend, and a couple of days later, in the local newspaper, in the letters to the editor, was a letter written by one of the vestry members, who said, "What a tragedy this is. We should not be doing this. We, as a historian, I believe we should keep this here as part of the history of this community. We should preserve it. Preservation. We are a people who take seriously preservation. Let me tell you how seriously we take it. As I was working on this homily, I decided I'm going to do a search of this phrase, the Society for the Preservation of. Try it. Try it. You will get a very, very long list of organizations that exist for the preservation of something. Of course, just about every town, village, or city has a society for the preservation of the history of that place, especially more historic, and they all think they are. The Society for the Preservation of this city, or the preservation of the history of that city, or of our village, or of this building, or whatever. But and there's so many things. There were two that really caught my attention, and I don't know why, but anyway, they did. One was the Society for the Preservation of Barbershop Quartets. I found that one, for some strange reason, interesting, and I don't want to go into any consideration of why. But the one that I really liked the most was the Society for the Preservation of Irish Soda Bread. Apparently, it needs a society for its preservation. I'm all about preservation. I'm all about tradition. I'm an Episcopalian. We uphold tradition. In fact, we enshrine it, we put it in concrete, or we put it in a glass case where everybody can see it. And it's about preservation of tradition that the Pharisees go to Jesus in today's gospel. Now, before you get down on the Pharisees, they're coming to Jesus because they have seen the erosion of the religious faith in the Israelites. And they've decided the only way that they can hold the faith there, that they can do that, is by maintaining the laws and traditions as handed down. So they become rather legalistic. And when they came to Jesus, they were concerned because the disciples are not washing their hands. Now, they don't care if they wash their hands to be clean or not. That's not an issue for them. They want them to wash their hands because it carries out that legal tradition of washing hands. And if we can maintain that tradition, then somehow we can maintain our faith. That's their goal. It's not just to be legalistic, to be legalistic. And so they put this before Jesus. Why can't you guys help us out here? In essence, they're saying to them, why can't you maintain tradition? We don't do it that way at this church. Help us maintain our tradition. And then Jesus looks at them and says these wonderful words that I'd like to paraphrase by simply saying, there's more to it than the tradition and the laws. At no point does Jesus tell them to not follow the laws. He says there's more than the laws. There's what's in your heart. There's what is in your heart. I'm one for maintaining tradition. But I'm also one who finds myself at times challenging the traditions that we have. You know my kind. I'm the one that a lot of times you don't want to see coming. I'm one of the ones that they talk about sometimes whose congregation sings songs and hymns that are not exactly all in our hymnals. I'm one of those priests whose church uses screens. God forbid we should only be using a prayer book, which I think is probably what is said by the Society for the Preservation of the Book of Common Prayer. There are traditions to which we latch ourselves and we become enamored with our traditions, and the traditions become our faith. The laws become what we have to fulfill. And if we can do that, we think all is hunky-dory. But in reality, what Jesus says to us is there's more to our faith in our lives than what you are doing. There's more to this than living out the canons, the rubrics, or the laws. That our faith has to do with how we live out our hearts. Because what is in our heart is what we live in the world. I don't think it's the least bit ironic that it was to the Pharisees who came and asked Jesus about the laws that he said there are two main laws, the summary of the laws. Love God and love neighbor. What is in our heart is how we love God and others. And don't get me wrong. Tradition is good. Tradition is fine. It helps hold us together. You know, what you may not know, or you may, I'm going to say it anyway, is that if it were not for the Pharisees, we would probably not have Judaism as it exists today. There may not be a Jewish faith. Because when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., they're the ones that held it all together and transitioned into the rabbinic Judaism that is rabbi-led rather than focused on the temple. So you see, tradition can be good. But when it gets in the way of our living out our faith in Christ and our love of God and others, then we need to make our decisions. Those tough decisions for the changes that have to be made. About 13 years ago, at that church, in that newly built, it wasn't new by this time, but in that parish house that was rebuilt, my wife and I celebrated the reception after our marriage. The change that took place there did not take away what was an important core aspect of our faith. But it opened up the possibilities of being faithful in new, different, and exciting ways. May God bless us in our traditions, but not let us set them in concrete and make them into idols. But remember forever that we are called to follow Christ in this place and in the world. Amen.